In September 2024, the mayor of a mid-sized American city declared a state of emergency over a Venezuelan gang most Americans had never heard of 6 months earlier. In Chile, lawmakers demanded military intervention. In Colombia, officials called it a destabilizing force. In Peru, politicians blamed it for a surge in extortion. By October, Tren de Aragua had become a name invoked in U.S. presidential debates, congressional hearings, and cable news segments warning of a new transnational threat pouring across open borders. Here's the uncomfortable question. How does a gang born inside a single Venezuelan prison become the explanation for crime patterns across 2 continents in under 5 years? And why does every government describing this threat propose a completely different solution? This isn't a story about whether Tren de Aragua exists. It does. This is about separating what we know from what we're being told to believe. Because when the same set of facts is used to justify militarizing borders, increasing deportations, and expanding surveillance on one hand, while others use it to argue for asylum protections and humanitarian intervention on the other, something more than crime analysis is happening. The threat is real enough to generate Interpol alerts, but the narrative has become a weapon. And that makes the truth harder to find. Let's start with what actually happened. Tren de Aragua did not begin as a transnational criminal empire. It began as a survival structure inside one of the most violent prison systems in the Western Hemisphere. Tocoron Prison, located in Aragua State, Venezuela. In the 2010s, as Venezuela's economy collapsed and state authority disintegrated, prisons became autonomous zones. Not metaphorically, literally. The Venezuelan government stopped maintaining control inside many facilities. Inmates ran their own internal economies, security structures, and hierarchies. At Tocoron, a group of inmates formalized this power. They didn't break out. They built in. They controlled smuggling routes, extortion networks, and eventually entire criminal operations that extended beyond the prison walls, while leadership remained inside. This wasn't unique to Venezuela. Criminal groups governing prisons exist in Brazil, El Salvador, Ecuador, and historically in Colombia. What made Tren de Aragua different was timing. It consolidated power inside Tocoron, just as Venezuela entered the worst migration crisis in Latin American history. Between 2015 and 2023, over 7 million Venezuelans fled the country. This migration wave moved through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and eventually north toward Central America and the United States. Some traveled legally, many didn't. And within that flow, Tren de Aragua found an expansion opportunity. Not because every migrant was a gang member, because migration routes create vulnerabilities, smuggling networks, unregulated labor markets, populations without legal status who can't report, crimes to authorities. This is where verified evidence begins to separate from political narrative. We know Tren de Aragua established cells in Colombia by 2018. Colombian authorities documented extortion rings targeting Venezuelan migrants in border cities like Cúcuta and later in Bogotá. We know the group expanded into Chile, where Chilean prosecutors linked them to prostitution networks and extortion schemes affecting Venezuelan migrant communities in Santiago. We know Peru issued alerts about their involvement in illegal mining operations in the Amazon region and extortion in Lima. We know Ecuador has reported their presence tied to prison violence and organized crime in Quito and Guayaquil. These are documented cases. Arrests have been made. Court proceedings have occurred. The group is real, and its activities are measurable. But here's the part that gets complicated. How big is Tren de Aragua? How centralized is its command structure? And how much of the crime attributed to the group is directly connected versus opportunistically labeled? In 2023, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security issued a threat assessment identifying Tren de Aragua as a growing concern. By mid-2024, That concern had escalated into political rhetoric describing the group as a near-peer threat to MS-13 and a primary driver of border insecurity. City officials in Aurora, Colorado, and other locations blamed apartment complex crimes on Tren de Aragua. Media coverage amplified these claims. But when investigators examined the actual evidence, the picture became less clear. Some arrests involved individuals with confirmed ties to the group. Others involved Venezuelan nationals accused of crimes with no direct organizational link. The label, Tren de Aragua, began to function as shorthand for Venezuelan-linked crime, whether or not the individuals involved had any connection to the prison-born network. This isn't a minor distinction. It's the difference between a centrally coordinated transnational organization and a decentralized brand being used by opportunistic actors. Experts who study organized crime warn against conflating the two. Groups like MS-13 or the Sinaloa cartel operate with hierarchical command structures, consistent revenue streams, and strategic territorial control. Tren de Aragua, according to most credible assessments, functions more like a loose franchise. Leadership inside Tocaron may maintain symbolic authority, but cells operating in Chile, Peru, or the United States appear to act with significant autonomy. They use the name for intimidation and recognition, but coordination across borders is limited. This matters because threat assessments drive policy. If Tren de Aragua is a tightly organized cartel, then targeting leadership and disrupting financial networks makes sense. If it's a decentralized brand used by multiple independent actors, then mass deportations and border crackdowns won't dismantle the organization. They'll relocate it, or rebrand it, or push it further underground. And here's where politics enters. In the United States, Tren de Aragua has become a talking point in immigration debates. Conservatives argue the group proves that open borders enable transnational crime and that mass deportations are a necessary response. Progressives argue the group is being exaggerated to justify hardline immigration policies and that addressing root causes in Venezuela is the real solution. Both sides reference the same DHS assessments. Both claim their approach is evidence-based. In Latin America, the pattern repeats. In Chile, right-wing politicians use Tren de Aragua to argue for tougher deportation laws targeting Venezuelan migrants. In Colombia, the group became a reason to question the country's open-door policy toward Venezuelan refugees. In Peru, officials pointed to Tren de Aragua when justifying increased police presence in migrant communities. Each country saw the same gang. Each country used it to reinforce pre-existing political agendas. This is the danger of threat inflation. When a real security concern becomes a political symbol, accuracy becomes secondary to utility. Nobody wants to be seen as soft on crime. Nobody wants to dismiss a legitimate threat. So the tendency is to accept the worst-case scenario as fact. And once that happens, contradictory evidence gets ignored. For example, multiple Latin American security analysts have pointed out that crime rates in cities with large Venezuelan migrant populations don't correlate cleanly with Tren de Aragua's presence. Some cities with confirmed gang activity saw crime drops. Others with no documented presence saw increases. The gang is a factor, but it's not the only factor. Economic conditions, local policing, and other criminal organizations all matter. But those complexities don't fit neatly into a 30-second political ad. Let's talk about what we don't know. We don't know the exact size of Tren de Aragua's membership. Estimates range from a few thousand to tens of thousands, depending on whether you count core members, affiliates, or anyone arrested while Venezuelan. We don't know the full scope of their revenue streams. Extortion, prostitution, smuggling, and theft are confirmed. Drug trafficking is suspected, but not consistently verified. We don't know how much operational control Tocaron leadership actually maintains over international cells, and we don't know how much of the group's expansion is strategic versus opportunistic. Here's what we do know. In September 2023, Venezuelan security forces raided Tocoron prison. They found a zoo, a nightclub, a baseball field, and a banking center. Tren de Aragua had turned the facility into a fortified criminal headquarters. The raid scattered leadership. Some were arrested. Others went underground. The operation disrupted the group's symbolic center of power, but it didn't dismantle the network. Because by that point, the network had already spread beyond Venezuela's borders. The raid also revealed something uncomfortable. For years, the Venezuelan government had known what was happening inside Tocoron. They had allowed it. Whether through corruption, incompetence, or strategic neglect, the state had enabled Tren de Aragua's rise. This matters because it undercuts the narrative that the group is purely a product of migration. It's a product of state collapse, and state collapse doesn't get fixed by deporting people. So where does this go? Let's map the realistic scenarios. Scenario 1. Tren de Aragua continues to expand as a decentralized brand. Cells operate independently across Latin America and the US. Law enforcement arrests individuals, but the organizational structure remains fluid. The name persists because it provides intimidation value. Crime attributed to the group fluctuates based on local conditions, not central coordination. In this scenario, mass deportations relocate the problem without solving it. Effective response requires local policing, community engagement, and addressing the economic vulnerabilities that make extortion and smuggling profitable. Scenario 2. Regional governments coordinate a sustained crackdown. Interpol expands its red notices. Extradition treaties are used more aggressively. Financial networks are targeted. In this scenario, Tren de Aragua fragments. Leadership is captured or killed. The brand loses value. But other groups fill the vacuum. Because the underlying conditions haven't changed. Venezuelan migrants still need work. Smuggling routes still exist. Unregulated economies still create opportunities for organized crime. Scenario 3. The political narrative overwhelms the security analysis. Tren de Aragua becomes the go-to explanation for any crime involving Venezuelans. Threat assessments become inflated. Policies get designed around worst-case assumptions. Migrant communities face increased surveillance and deportation regardless of individual involvement. In this scenario, the gang becomes secondary to the politics. The focus shifts from dismantling a criminal organization to managing a domestic political problem. And the actual security threat gets harder to measure because the data is contaminated by bias. Scenario 4. Venezuela stabilizes. Sanctions ease. The migration crisis slows. Economic opportunities return. In this scenario, Tren de Aragua loses its primary expansion mechanism. Fewer Venezuelans are fleeing. Fewer vulnerabilities exist along migration routes. The group doesn't disappear, but its growth trajectory changes. This scenario requires international political shifts that currently seem unlikely. But it's the only one that addresses the root cause rather than the symptom. None of these scenarios are predictions. They're possibilities. And which one unfolds depends on decisions being made right now by governments across 2 continents. Here's why this matters to you. If you live in the United States, Tren de Aragua is being used to justify everything from border wall funding to asylum restrictions to local policing budgets. If you live in Latin America, it's being used to shape migration policy, security spending, and attitudes toward Venezuelan refugees. If you're Venezuelan, the gang has become a stigma that follows your entire nationality regardless of your personal story. And here's the deeper problem. When security threats become political tools, we lose the ability to respond effectively. Because effective response requires accurate assessment. And accurate assessment requires separating what we know from what we fear. Right now, Tren de Aragua exists in both categories simultaneously. The group is real. The threat is measurable. But the narrative has outpaced the evidence. Intelligence agencies warn about expansion. Politicians demand action. Media outlets run alarming headlines. And in the middle of all that noise, the actual data gets lost. How many crimes are directly attributable to centrally coordinated Tren de Aragua operations versus loosely affiliated actors versus misidentified incidents? Nobody has a clean answer. Because the incentive structure doesn't reward precision. It rewards alarm. This is the pattern we've seen before, with MS-13, with drug cartels, with terrorist organizations. A real threat emerges. It gets politicized. The politics inflate the threat. The inflation justifies expanded powers. And by the time we look back, the original problem has either been solved, displaced, or replaced by something worse. Tren de Aragua is real. But the story you're being told about Tren de Aragua is shaped by interests that have nothing to do with your safety. Some want to restrict migration. Some want to expand law enforcement. Some want to deflect blame for domestic failures. And all of them have an incentive to make you believe the worst-case scenario. The question isn't whether you should be concerned. The question is whether you're being given accurate information to make informed decisions. Because when the same facts justify opposite policies, the facts aren't driving the policy. The politics are. And that should make you uncomfortable. Because the next time a threat emerges, the pattern will repeat. And we'll have even less ability to tell the difference between what's real and what's useful. Tren de Aragua didn't become a transnational crisis because of migration. It became a transnational crisis because of state collapse, political opportunism, and a migration system that creates vulnerabilities faster than it resolves them. Fixing that requires more than arrests and deportations. It requires addressing why millions of people are fleeing in the first place, and why criminal organizations thrive in the spaces between borders, laws, and failed states. That's the conversation nobody wants to have, because it's complicated, expensive, and doesn't fit into a campaign slogan. But it's the only conversation that leads to an actual solution. Everything else is just managing the symptom while the disease spreads.